My name's John Franklin, for those of you who may not know, and I serve as Executive Director of Imago, and it's Imago that's hosting this evening. And I'm very pleased to see so many of you here, actually, because, boy, I heard from a lot of people, oh, I can't get there. I wish I could. So it had me wondering, but this is a comfortable group. So we're very pleased to have you here. So tonight we're here to focus on the life and work of George MacDonald. For those of you who may not know, 1824 to 1905, which, if you think about it for a moment, this is why we're doing something. It's because it's 200 years ago that George MacDonald was born. Though known through some of his fantasy writings and perhaps some of his novels, he's not had the profile that several who he influenced have had. And I'm thinking of Chesterton, Tolkein, and C.S. Lewis. Anniversaries provide opportunity not only to celebrate, but to extend our knowledge and understanding of figures like George MacDonald. My knowledge of MacDonald has been quite limited, and I'm glad to have learned much in recent months that has deepened both my appreciation for the man and for his work. MacDonald's attention to the importance of human imagination is a significant draw for me. I'm pretty interested in imagination and what it does and how it fits to help us to get meaning in life. For MacDonald, imagination serves as a bridge between our lived experience of material reality and our sense of spirituality, that which is beyond appearances, beyond the material world. So for MacDonald, imagination is this bridge between those two realities. Trevor Hart, a theologian and keen appreciator of the arts, says this of MacDonald: his writing conjures up a vision of a world in which complex order of non-material and spiritual realities is set in a counterpoint to the material sphere of nature. So you've got the non-material and spiritual realities, and then counterpoint to that, you have the material sphere of nature. And human beings are understood to be wonderfully situated as conscious participants in both dimensions at once. And that's really a gift that we have as human beings. The material and non-material meet, and we have to hold these things together, engaging the realities of each through the realities of the other. So for MacDonald, it's imagination which is at the heart of our capacity to do this, which really gives imagination a pretty central role. But MacDonald's creative impulse brought him not only to author novels and works of fantasy, but also to write hymns, poems, and theological reflections. He served for a time as a minister of a congregation, and he's written devotional works as well. On tonight's program, we're going to take time to sing a few of MacDonald's hymns. And my hope is that this will provide for us a deeper sense of the man and his thought. And we're going to begin with a hymn, and then I will introduce our speaker. Another hymn will follow Kirstin's talk, and after that we'll have some conversation, which you'll be invited to join in. So I'm very glad to see you all here, and I want to welcome you again and say, I hope you'll find this something of an inspiration. Now, to lead us in those hymns, well, one to begin with, I'm pleased to have Andrew Donaldson here this evening. When I thought to include MacDonald hymns in this evening's program, Andrew, the first person who came to mind to lead our singing was Andrew. I could probably give you an answer to that if you asked me why, but anyway, it just seemed, yes, Andrew's the person I want to be in touch with. I met Andrew some years ago when he was the music director at a Presbyterian church in the East End of Toronto. Andrew is a guitarist, a composer, a text writer. He's written a number of hymns. And from 2011 to 2016, he was a worship consultant to the World Council of Churches in Geneva. During those years, he edited Hosanna, a collection of global ecumenical songs. And he's co-editor of the Book of Praise for the Presbyterian Church in Canada. And he's also a past president and fellow of the Hymn Society in US and Canada. 2007, he received an honorary Doctorate of Divinity degree from Knox College, University of Toronto, for his work in congregational song. And I think Andrew's wife, Wendy, will join him as he leads us. But Andrew, I'm delighted that you're here. Please come and take us back to the 19th century. Thank you. Please welcome Andrew.
Thank you, John, and thank you everybody for being here. I'm going to start by disappointing you in that the music does come from the 19th century, but it's not a tune that I think George MacDonald sang this to. Hymns are a dramatic form, and so singing them together gives you a different feeling from just reading the text. And I looked over the tunes to which this first one that we're going to sing, I Love Thy Skies, was likely sung, and thought that I had better choose one that might be more familiar to North American singers. Now, we're going to start into it, and as you recognize it, as I'm sure you will, you have music with you, I believe. Everybody have music? This tune is called Belmont, famously sung to by Cool Siloam's Shady Rill, and other texts. So we're going to start and invite you to join us as you feel led by the Spirit.
Thy
you, Wendy. Lovely words, those. Very impressive. The person we've invited this evening to speak to us is Kirstin Jeffrey Johnson, and she comes to us well qualified to speak about George MacDonald. Kirstin did a master's degree at Regent College, where her thesis supervisor was, well, a familiar name, Eugene Peterson. And she also holds a PhD from St. Andrews University in Scotland, where she wrote a thesis on George MacDonald under the supervision of Trevor Hart, the person I quoted a few moments ago. Kirstin has published widely in both print and online, and she's lectured internationally on MacDonald and related themes. Earlier this month, I had the privilege of attending a two-day George MacDonald conference at St. Andrews University, where Kirstin gave the opening plenary address on borderlands and liminality in George MacDonald. An example would be that space or borderland between the material and the spiritual, which I spoke about a few moments ago. There's something about MacDonald who was very interested in borderlands, and I think it's an interesting theme for today as well. Kirstin is on advisory boards for both the Inklings Journal titled 7, V11, or II, and the MacDonald Journal called North Wind, and she is co-chair of the International George MacDonald Society. And when not MacDonalding, her words, Kirstin directs Windstone Farm, Linlathen, located in the Ottawa Valley where she grew up. It's a nonprofit that seeks to facilitate and encourage community through theology, ecology, and the arts. Linlathen was inspired by another 19th century figure, Thomas Erskine, who sought to gather small groups of like-minded people to engage in conversation that was constructive and life-giving, conversation on themes of shared interest. And let me note that we live at a time when people are hungry for meaningful conversations. And they're hungry for those conversations that will be life-giving and life-enriching. My hope is that our time together tonight may also serve that end. So I'll ask in just a moment for Kirstin to come forward and give us her talk. And then after that, Andrew will come back and we'll do another hymn. And then we'll have an opportunity for interview conversation, and then we will invite you to join that conversation with your comments or questions. So listen carefully so that when the time comes, you may have some comments or questions to make. Kirstin, it's a real pleasure for me to welcome you here this evening. I'm delighted that you can be here. We've thought about doing this for a long time, but planning was a challenge, at least in my life. But very glad that you're here this evening. So please, folks, join me in welcoming Kirstin Jeffrey Johnson. Okay? Bless you. Bless you.
Thank you, John. It's a real privilege and joy to be here. And
You need to go, I think, straight
into that.
Straight into it as much as you can.
Okay. I'll go ahead and explain to you that I have been kindly loaned a second laptop due to some of the tech difficulties here. And so I am going to figure out how to enter the password. Our tech world here. There we go. That is wonderful. We're going to be sliding laptops around. And this has been an interesting technology day for me. My PowerPoint crashed. Thank you very much. Crashed about maybe 3 hours ago now. So not long before John was picking me up, I lost everything. It told me it was corrupted. And so I really enjoy PowerPoints. And I do. I'm being quite serious because I have an unusual condition called aphantasia. I cannot see images within my own mind. And so for me, images are really helpful to see what people are talking about. And I find when I'm talking about new names or new ideas or long quotations that it helps people who are listening to me as well. And so I love spending a lot of time pulling together my PowerPoints. And you will see tonight, we're going to be image heavy at the beginning, and then you'll see where I was still trying to put together all the pictures that disappeared. But the most important thing for me is that I do have the quotations that I'll be reading on here, so hopefully you'll be able to track those. But apologies for the sporadic nature of the images today. Let's start here. No man could sing as he has sung, had others not sung before him. Deep answereth unto deep, face to face, praise to praise. To the sound of the trumpet, the harp returns its own vibrating response. Alike, but oh, how different. I think this utterance of George MacDonald could serve as a banner for Imago, not least as it's a verbalization of so much that John and Imago does. And so I think it's a good place for us to begin this evening with the recognition that we, whether in the world of the arts or of social justice or theology or science, of work or worship, could not work or worship, create or educate the way that we do had not others navigated the journey before us. And people like C.S. Lewis, G.K. Chesterton, Madeline L'Engle, all singers who are keen to introduce their audiences to the different musics that have impacted and changed and shaped them, they all point to one particular vocalist, let's call him, whose song has impacted them more than any other. I am here tonight to introduce you to this voice, the voice and the person of the 19th century polymath George MacDonald, to join my own voice to the many varied others who, like Lewis, Chesterton, and L'Engle, were and are keen for his work to be better known. There are many here tonight for whom the name of MacDonald is new. And yet, I do know that there are others who know his work deeply and well here. And so whilst much of what we discuss tonight will be introductory, it will hopefully be setting us up for deep and thoughtful conversation over nibbles afterwards, yes, but also in the weeks and months and years ahead, I hope, in the years ahead. My hope is that you will leave tonight being challenged, as George MacDonald has challenged so many, in your reflections upon concepts of imagination and inspiration, of community and communication, perhaps even of interdisciplinarity and hospitality. But I'm also guessing that more of you have already been impacted by MacDonald than you are aware, precisely because of the antiphony of voices that he both encouraged and inspired. I'm sure a good handful of you know that C.S. Lewis is very vocal about how deeply the writing of MacDonald impacted not only his writing, but his understanding of faith, he says, his vocational attitude and his philosophy of life. James MacDonald is the primary impactor on those. The famous phrase is that reading MacDonald baptized Lewis's imagination, that it made him hungry for holiness and taught him to long for goodness. Even to learn to see goodness is far more fascinating than evil. Lewis at one point says that he doubts he ever wrote a work without quoting MacDonald, and that is no exaggeration. From his teens right until his death, Lewis was always inviting others to read this man he called his spiritual master. That's C.S. Lewis's words. In writing to a friend about important teachers of faith, Lewis references people like, in the letter, he references people like Augustine, Athanasius, Boethius, Hooker, and then he proceeds to explain that for himself, it is actually to George MacDonald that he owes his own greatest debt. Sometimes I feel like I need to point out to people I'm not putting these words in Lewis's mouth. They are his own words. Lewis read a stanza of poetry by MacDonald almost every night before bed throughout his adulthood. And whilst that might sound almost like an obsession, perhaps this quotation makes some sense of such a choice. I dare not say MacDonald is never in error, but to speak plainly, I know hardly any other writer who seems to be closer or more continually close to the Spirit of Christ himself. Lewis spent as much time as he did in the company of his literary friend, MacDonald, because of MacDonald's expressions of his own relationship with and understanding of God. So, if C.S. Lewis has impacted you, so has MacDonald. Now, G.K. Chesterton wrote, "In a certain rather special sense, I, for one, can really testify to a book that has made a difference to my whole existence, which helped me to see things in a certain way from the start. A vision of things which even so real a revolution as a change of religious allegiance has substantially only crowned and confirmed. Of all the stories I have read, including even all the novels of the same novelist, it remains the most real, the most realistic, and in the exact sense of the phrase, the most like life. It is called The Princess and the Goblin and is by George MacDonald." Chesterton writes of how reading MacDonald changed his vision. It taught him to lift his eyes from a book and see how daily we are surrounded by wondrous magic that infuses every leaf on every tree. He calls MacDonald a St. Francis of Aberdeen, who saw a sort of halo around every flower and bird. It is not the same thing as any poet's appreciation of the beauty of a flower or bird. It is a certain special sense of significance, which the tradition that most values it calls sacramental. Chesterton speaks of how MacDonald deepened his ways of thinking about God. Carlyle could have never said anything so subtle and simple as MacDonald saying that God is easy to please and hard to satisfy. And I find this one of the most significant and prophetic comments by Chesterton. When MacDonald comes to be more carefully studied as a mystic, as I think he will be when people discover the possibility of collecting jewels scattered in a rather irregular setting, it will be found, I fancy, that he stands for a rather important turning point in the history of Christendom. As Protestants speak of the morning stars of the Reformation, we may be allowed to note such names here and there as morning stars of the reunion. May it be so. For those of you who, and this is the right sort of crowd, love the chapter in Chesterton's Orthodoxy called Ethics in Elfland, then really you are loving his paraphrasing of some of his favorite bits from MacDonald's essays on the imagination. Even the Father Brown tales have occasionally explicit MacDonald allusions threading through them, and adventures such as The Man Who Was Thursday are redolent with them. If Chesterton has impacted you, so has MacDonald. Madeline L'Engle credited MacDonald not only with shaping, but also, she writes, saving her understanding of God and her ability to be an artist. 30 years ago, I had the great gift of being able to take a writing class with L'Engle. And in that class, she told us that when she died, after spending time with the Trinity, the first thing she wanted to do was climb up into George MacDonald's lap and have him tell her a story. In her very MacDonald-esque book, Walking on Water, she writes, "George MacDonald gives me renewed strength during times of trouble, times when I've seen people tempted to deny God, when he says, 'The Son of God suffered under death, not that men might not suffer, but that their sufferings might be like his.'" She writes of how the manner in which MacDonald's scriptural grounding shaped his writing was tutelage for her own. She adds, "Meeting George MacDonald's writing when I was very young was a blessing to my understanding of God and creation and our own small but potentially beautiful place in it. As MacDonald makes clear all through his writing, God promises us joy, but not safety, a full life, but not a painless one, the laughter that comes with full faith in God's loving purpose, but also tears. He promises us a broad road with a narrow gate, with lions and other wild beasts ready to attack unless love speaks first, and angels are standing by." If Madeline L'Engle has impacted you, so has George MacDonald. And the list goes on. Famously, a shared love of MacDonald was one of the first connecting points for Tolkien and Lewis. Tolkien wrote of MacDonald's mystical tales of power and beauty, and he read MacDonald to his own children as they grew up, just as he had been read MacDonald as a child. Akin to Chesterton, Tolkien's famous essay on imagination called On Fairy Stories is also, you will realize upon reading MacDonald's own, greatly indebted to MacDonald's writings on the topic. Owen Barfield, another of the Inklings whose work echoes MacDonald's imagination essays, also deepened his relationship with these men through mutual gratitude of MacDonald's impact. Now, it's actually nigh impossible to list the vast variety of even known names of people whose lives and work were shaped by MacDonald during his own lifetime, let alone since. So I'm just going to give you a list of some of the ones that I think may have impacted some of these people, some of you here, some of us gathered here tonight. Mark Twain, he read George MacDonald on his honeymoon, and he had to ask MacDonald for a new copy of Back of the North Wind as his children wore their first copy out. Thanks to Charles Dodgson, AKA Lewis Carroll, and that's Lewis Carroll there with some of MacDonald's children. So thanks to him, we have lots of photos of the MacDonald family. Lewis Carroll, if you don't know, was an early photographer. And so thanks to him, we've got lots of wonderful pictures of MacDonald and his children. And MacDonald's children convinced him to publish a book that he was lugging around and reading to them occasionally in manuscript called Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Dodgson's letters, Lewis Carroll's letters to the MacDonald children are hilarious, and they've got great pictures jotted all over them, and sometimes from pretending to be from different actors and different people, and they're actually from Lewis Carroll. He had a great fun playing with them, writing letters with them, but he also greatly delighted in joining in the whole family when they performed plays. And Dodgson, Lewis Carroll, and George MacDonald had fun playing with each other's ideas in their writings as well. You can track that through some of their texts back and forth where they respond to each other in their published books. So did, for that matter, John Ruskin and George MacDonald. The two had long discussions in person and in text over ideas of beauty, story, myth, truth, art, light, and more. And the letters between these two make clear that MacDonald also served as a sort of spiritual confidant and pastor to Ruskin as well. As he was pastor and confidant to the Mount Temples, and Georgina and William Mount Temple were, in essence, the founders of the Keswick movement, if you are familiar with the Keswick movement, which still hosts conferences today. The earliest versions of that were called Broadlands. They occurred in their home at Broadlands, and MacDonald taught there amongst some of these first teachers. Lilias Trotter, the artist, writes of how MacDonald shaped her entire worldview. He had similar impact on reformers such as Octavia Butler and Josephine Butler. Florence Nightingale transcribed passages of MacDonald's fiction to bring with her to the Crimea. And really interestingly, she would take out the name of the character of the story and replace it with her own. So that in the text, she was reading the story of encouragement to herself in the text. James Barrie, Frances Hodgson Burnett, Lucy Maud Montgomery, Mary Mapes Dodge, Elizabeth Googe, Maurice Sendak are all amongst those who give nods or more to the impact to their appreciation of George MacDonald. W.B. Yeats, T.S. Eliot, W.H. Auden, Lloyd Alexander, Ursula Le Guin, Nigel Marsh. Writers still living include Margaret Atwood, who started a master's here on Lewis, Tolkien, Rider Haggard, and George MacDonald. Bet you didn't know that one. Frederick Buechner, the founders of the Rabbit Room. If you're familiar with the Rabbit Room, musician Andrew Peterson and playwright A.S. Peterson point to MacDonald as one of their primary influences. Malcolm Guite, the pastor-poet, who's the current president of the George MacDonald Society. And actually, the list of contemporary writers that I know of today who name MacDonald as a primary impact on their writing is just way too long to travel down, which is kind of exciting. And if you recognize some of these illustrations or some of these hands, Arthur Hughes, E.H. Shepard, the illustrator of Winnie the Pooh, Jessie Wilcox Smith, Maurice Sendak, as mentioned earlier, of Where the Wild Things Are, they represent a vast compendium of artists who have and who still are engaging with MacDonald's work. Some really exciting new illustrations and versions have come out with Lilith and with the Golden Key, and that's ongoing right now. The Rabbit Room in particular, publishing a bunch of those. I wanted just to throw these up for you to see them because I think they're pretty sumptuous. These are illustrations by Arthur Hughes, the Pre-Raphaelite associate Arthur Hughes. The picture of the girl in the dress is an illustration called Beauty and the Beast, and the model is one of George MacDonald's daughters, Mary Josephine, getting ready for one of the family's performances of Beauty and the Beast. The fairly well-known painting by Hughes there called The Night of the Sun, it's got a number of different verses, is a painting that shows up in one of George MacDonald's novels, is discussed in one of his novels, and when it was shown in the Royal Academy, had George MacDonald quotation written around it, as did the stair illustration by Arthur Hughes, which also had a poem by George MacDonald about ascending the stair on it. Arthur Hughes' nephew, who's also a Pre-Raphaelite associate, Edward Hughes, was engaged to Mary, the model there. Unfortunately, she died before they could get married, but you may recognize, if you don't know Hughes' name, you may recognize these illustrations, which to me are very evocative of MacDonald's work, and he was integrated with the family for most of his life until long after Mary died. Now, those are visual influences, literary influences, but there are also those that you might categorize as more theological, and this is where my slideshow started to fall apart, and I didn't get a chance to put all the images back up. But Oswald Chambers, My Utmost for His Highest, actually has passages in it that Chambers' wife thought were by Chambers, but were actually his, like Florence Nightingale, his own writing out of passages from George MacDonald. So if you grew up reading My Utmost for His Highest, you grew up reading some passages of MacDonald's in there. Philip Brooks, the famous preacher and writer of O Little Town of Bethlehem, when he heard MacDonald preach here in North America in the 1872 tour, said that MacDonald was the most gifted preacher that he had ever heard. Hans Urs von Balthasar, who translated C.S. Lewis's anthology of MacDonald quotations into German. Philip Yancey, theologian James Torrance, James Houston, founder of Regent College, Lauren Wilkinson, the godfather of the Christian ecological movement, the founder of ITIA, as mentioned earlier, at St. Andrews, the Institute of Theology and Imagination in the Arts, Trevor Hart, Calvin scholar Julie Canlis, theologians Richard Bauckham, Judith Wolfe, John McMurray, Justin Bailey, Paul Fittis. These are all people who point to MacDonald as shaping how they think about God, the imagination, the arts. MacDonald's work has been set to music since early in his own career, perhaps not surprising as he was so music-oriented himself. Hamish McEwen and Gustav Holst are amongst the earliest folk to do so, but even today you can find a wide variety of contemporary musicians so inspired, ranging from John Rutter of the Cambridge singer fame, Ron Block of Alison Krauss and Union Station, Tori Amos, the harpist Tombra, the Waterboys, Jack Redford, who you may know from his work with Jeremy Begbie and Dita down at Duke University, and an interestingly growing body of young choral composers such as Josh Rodriguez, Matthew Roy, Eric Padziadora. And if we throw categories to the wind, dancer Twyla Tharp, playwright Murray Watts, science historians Francisca Colt and Carrie Magruder, theoretical physicist Tom McLeish, Indigenous pastor musician Cheryl Bear, environmental activists and leaders such as Leah Costomo and David and Shauna Anderson of Arasha, and Jane Goodall, famous for her work with the chimpanzees, who recently wrote in her autobiography of the impact of Back to the North Wind on her childhood. These all claim an impact by MacDonald on who they are, on what they do, and how they think. So as is probably fairly evident, I do want you to notice not just the wide variety of types of personalities for whom MacDonald has been deeply significant, nor just the variety of theological and philosophical perspectives represented, but also that this is not just a group of writers, nor even just a group that represents a wide variety of arts, but also theologians, also people involved in social action, culture engagers, and changers. And I think I can safely bet that somewhere in that long list of different people, there will be even just a few persons who have somehow had an impact upon you somewhere along the way. If so, I invite you to think of how their voices may have been shaped by MacDonald's and how the confluences may have shaped you. So let me give you a bit of introduction to this man who captured such a wide variety of imaginations. MacDonald was a 19th century farm kid from Aberdeenshire, Scotland. He was privileged to be born into a family that highly valued the arts, literature, history, languages, and scripture. Although he did have one grandparent who gets talked about a lot, who struggled with the misguided perspective that music and story and flights of the imagination were guaranteed to tempt one away from God's divine purpose, that this was not the environment of his own household. So he did have a grandmother who thought that way, but that's not the household in which he was raised. That was one of music and story, and letters indicate much hilarity. MacDonald writes of fond memories of riding out into the hills on his horse and flopping across her back to read the likes of Arabian Nights, Bunyan, Milton, and Coleridge. His family was a mix of classically educated farmers and business entrepreneurs, and conversations about science, agriculture, local politics, and social challenges seem to have been part of the household milieu. Amongst his family on both sides, there was a wide mix of denominations represented. He had relatives who were clergy in the Church of Scotland, in the Free Kirk, and in the Anglican Church. And there was also Catholics, Independents, and Congregationalists. As a child, MacDonald loved reading the sermons. As a child, I've read his letters indicating such on holiday, on the beach. He writes letters back talking about how he loves reading the sermons of Scottish divine Thomas Chalmers. Chalmers was a close friend of one of his uncles. And MacDonald even memorized and performed at least one of Chalmers' sermons when he was only 13. He and his cousin taught Sunday school together, and his schoolmaster writes of him regaling classmates with old stories in the town's castle ruins. That schoolmaster was a good one, who encouraged MacDonald in his reading and writing. The schoolmaster previous to him represented the expression of repressive federal Calvinism, which also did exist in that community. When MacDonald's younger brother began school, this dour schoolmaster beat the lad severely for not having memorized the Westminster Confession properly. Young James, already physically fragile, died not long afterwards. And some people in the community believed it was due to the beating. Regardless, whether that was true or not, the minister in MacDonald's church, a man MacDonald loved and respected not only as a child, but who he continued to praise even decades after he moved away. That man immediately had the abusive teacher removed and replaced with the good teacher. I think awareness of this tragic story gives particular insight to the ferocity with which MacDonald fought such broken theology throughout his life. As one of his sons later wrote, bred in a land of religious division, his whole fight was against schism. He made no war upon the church as he knew it, whether independent, Presbyterian, or Anglican. His war was upon the faithlessness of the officially faithful, and incidentally, only upon one or two Calvinistic and Augustinian dogmas, exaggerated out of all proportion to their service. His whole fight was against schism. His war was upon the faithlessness of the officially faithful. These phrases are central for understanding MacDonald aright. MacDonald would later attend a Congregationalist seminary for a couple of years, and he pastored for a brief time in that denomination. He attended a variety of churches himself as an adult, and always guest preached in churches of many different denominations. But in his early 40s, he chose to officially become an Anglican. Throughout his life, he continued to fight in a variety of ways what he viewed as the greatest evil to face humans: relational schism. Before James's death, that young brother, sorrow had already broken into MacDonald's child home early. Their mother had died when MacDonald was only 7. But he nonetheless writes of wonderful memories in the busy house that his father and brothers shared with his uncle and his wife and children. They're all together, the two families in one house. And when MacDonald's father remarried, it was to a woman who MacDonald and his siblings dearly loved, and whose arts-loving family seemed to fit in just perfectly with the MacDonalds. Illness was never far away, though. Within just a few years of MacDonald's moving down to England, his 2 remaining younger brothers, a half-sister, and his father all died, all from the same tubercular diseases that plagued MacDonald throughout his life, and which later claimed the lives of 3 of his own children. It is thus no surprise that readers like Madeline L'Engle have found such a profound understanding of suffering in MacDonald's work, alongside his celebration of beauty and goodness and joy. Before moving to England, MacDonald studied at the University of Aberdeen, where he excelled in mathematics and the sciences, and where he dreamed of a career in one or the other. Despite encouraging offers from professors both in Scotland and in Germany, MacDonald was not able to financially afford to follow either of these routes. And so he headed down to London, where he tutored in a family for a while. Unsure of his direction, he eventually decided to try seminary, although his father believed that he was far better suited for classroom teaching, which was where he eventually ended up. His father was right. MacDonald himself communicates in his letters at the time that he yet has hopes of becoming a published writer. He had already published 1 poem by that time and was beginning some translation work as well. MacDonald seems to have enjoyed his time at seminary, yet he was also dissatisfied at how limited the subjects of study were. There was no science. And so he decided to tutor classmates himself in chemistry on the side. There was no study of literature. But he and some classmates found their way to some lectures by a pastor-turned-professor named A.J. Scott, a man who is passionate about the importance of knowing the stories of one's inheritance. Scott was a brilliant literature teacher and in fact helped design the then brand new discipline of English literature, arguing that whilst the Greek and Latin classics were important to study in university, so too was Chaucer, Shakespeare, Sidney, Spenser, Herbert, etc. And once upon a time that statement would have seemed crazy, that someone was having to argue that studying such writers as Shakespeare in university was actually worthwhile. But it really struck me this morning that perhaps we need another Scott again. As you likely know, literature and theater and arts departments are being shut down in universities everywhere. In Christian universities in this country, those are the ones they're getting rid of first, in lieu of economics and business. The university in Canterbury, I was just in England with some of the professors there. The university in Canterbury has just announced that it is closing its literature department. Chaucer and his Canterbury Tales will no longer be taught in Canterbury, unless perhaps the still standing religious studies department gets radical. But business, economics, economically viable courses are being taught. I think it's time we start being subversive in new ways. A.J. Scott, whilst arguing the importance of knowing the literature of one's country and one's inheritance, also argued for the importance of knowing biblical stories, church history, from patristics through to Reformation and beyond, their country's history, their country's literature, and even the history of their country's philosophy. Scott believed that such deepening of identity could only enrich one's faith and relationship with God, and that it would also thus enrich understanding and relationship with other humans. At a time when English Parliament was arguing both that it was dangerous for the nation to allow tertiary education, university education for working class people, that could lead to revolution, and that it was dangerous for the psychological health and even possibly the reproductive health to allow tertiary education for women, and this was argued for almost the entire 19th century in Parliament. Scott was arguing that the nation could only improve both internally and in its relations with other nations if these members of the human race were also allowed such study. And he did not just argue this. He and his colleagues, such as F.D. Morris, put their arguments into action, praxis, helping set up working men's colleges, women's colleges, and designing interdisciplinary programs open to the general public. with such a caliber of education that, as with MacDonald and his young colleagues, seminary students were supplementing their education by attending these courses. MacDonald caught Scott's passion for the manner in which the biblical text models a shaping and a discovery identity through the telling and sharing and knowing of stories, of how the stories inform identity not just through acquisition, but in their stewardship. That in knowing the stories of Scripture, one is better able to read and ingest and comprehend not just the relatively few unstoried parts of the Bible, say the epistles, but also find insights in the congruences between the stories. He caught Scott's passion for how all of these culminate in the story that holds it all together, the life and death and life of Christ. Scott encouraged his students to keep applying what a student of the Bible learns to the stories that then follow Scripture, to recognize the continuation of intertextual conversations, and to learn from and join in with them, to keep alert for when and where Dante might be playing with an idea that Paul had been exploring in the epistles, which might have been engaging with the Gospel's engagement with Isaiah, and then to be ready to see when the same theme or symbol shows up in Boethius, and or Athanasius, and or Chaucer, and or Shakespeare, and or Luther, and or Herbert, and or Coleridge. Scott encouraged attentiveness to these confluences, points of resonance, often of intentional conversation, of antiphony. A few of the pre-Raphaelite crowd were drawn in to teach art at the colleges, as was and did their mentor himself, John Ruskin. In fact, Ruskin considered A.J. Scott a very important mentor of his own, and like Thomas Carlyle, Ruskin considers Scott, both of them considered Scott the best Dante scholar of their day. Dante, of course, being the great champion of story and of relationality. And although I've not yet been able to find many primary records of this, because of Scott's relationship with and mentoring of singers and musicians, such as Chopin, I'm pretty sure the role of music entered his practices too. We do know that it did with the man who became one of his most avid students and successful protégés, George MacDonald. MacDonald, himself soon a lifelong literature teacher and scholar, in addition to being an author and poet, had learned to study in his studying under Scott, as well as his studying under F.D. Morris and Thomas Chalmers and Thomas Erskine and other quite diverse kindreds, that every part of God's creation somehow holds together. And if we have forgotten how, then it is beholden to anyone who desires to better understand and to know the Creator to question and seek and discover how, to know the wonders of God's handiwork. To know them requires a closer attentiveness both to humans in their diversity of being and expression, but also to the flora and the fauna, the mountains and the caverns, the oceans and the galaxies, the cosmos. MacDonald's entire body of work is deeply infused with Scripture. Isaiah, the Psalms, Proverbs are everywhere, and he engages with Old and New Testament passages in depth, both implicitly and explicitly. This is a man who read the book daily in both Greek and Hebrew, as well often in other languages. But the two New Testament passages that he seems to evoke most often, perhaps in every book-length text, certainly in most of them, are Acts 17 and John 3. Acts 17 is the Mars Hill passage. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needs anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, so that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any of one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. That's in the NIV version. Keep your eyes alert when reading MacDonald, whether a fairy tale, a novel, or a sermon, for that phrase, live and move and have our being. And when you find it, ask what he is evoking. The other passage is John 3. After Christ explains to Nicodemus the necessity of being born of both water and of the Spirit, he explains, "The wind bloweth where it listeth, and thou hearest the sound thereof, but canst not tell whence it cometh, and whither it goeth. So is everyone that is born of the Spirit." From there, Christ carries on with a passage so familiar to us, "For God so loved the cosmos," not just humans, but everything in it, "that he gave his only begotten Son." I think references to this passage show up MacDonald's corpus even more than Acts 17, in essays, novels, fairy tales, poems, and as you have already just sung, in hymns. "The wind bloweth where it lists," or listeth. This is a pneumatological phrase that is so key for MacDonald. MacDonald is always pulling his readers into awareness of how all things hold together, or should, that the more attention we pay to one part of the work of his hands, the better we will understand another. Not just in seeing how story and philosophy and theology and history inform each other and have key congruencies, but also science and social action and visual arts and performance arts, geology and refraction and color theory and forgiveness and housing laws and exegesis and immigration policies and mental health awareness. All of these things weave into his work, always with one part somehow illuminating the other. MacDonald constantly pulls his readers into introductions to other writers and painters and musicians and thespians and philosophers of the past who paid attention to the relationships interwoven throughout the cosmos, and who sought to better understand how they might inform each other, and to share wonder, even worship. Ruskin had reminded MacDonald of the multivalent meanings latent in the words wind, breath, spirit. How in Hebrew and in Greek, the same word is used for all three, ruach, pneuma, and how that helps one think in new ways about inspiration, of the in-breathing that is given by God. And through every crevice of MacDonald's work, whether he's discussing the evils of eugenics and vivisection, whether he's describing the song of a grandmother's spinning wheel, whether he is exegeting Dante, extolling the virtues of Philip Sidney, having a raven chastise a student lost in dimensions of self, a fiddler weep as he plays an ancient lament, a child sigh as she follows a gossamer thread through a very scary dark cave. That wind is blowing where it listeth, breathing divine presence, inviting glimpses of revelation. This is also evident not only when he's practicing his vocation as a professor of literature, but also when he's pastoring Ruskin, caring for wives of the Pre-Raphaelites, hosting theater and picnics with Lewis Carroll and Mark Twain and the Fisk Jubilee Singers, when he and his family are performing Pilgrim's Progress and The Light Princess and Shakespeare and Emile Zola plays in tiny villages through Scotland, in cities in England and Italy and France, when he's explaining to young activists that creating art centers and establishing affordable housing are just as much forms of ministry as giving thoughtful sermons and knowing one's parish. It is evident when he ignores social mores and invites impoverished Italians into his home for charades and music. When he reminds us to see a snowdrop both as a botanical marvel and a poetic evocation. When he comes to Toronto and Hamilton and Montreal and a bunch of American cities on the eastern seaboard, as he did in 1872, and introduces thousands and thousands to the lyricism of Robert Burns, the complexities of Hamlet, and the mysteries of the imagination. Even in the apparent generosity with which he argued for the import of the Trinity with Unitarian Henry Bellows. MacDonald speaks of a wise imagination as being the presence of the Spirit of God. And I think here he is invoking this promise of presence, of the inspiration, the in-breathing that can occur when we choose to participate both with the worship of others, attention to the antiphonies God has placed around us, as well as to seek to participate with the promised divine presence. And I'm not sure MacDonald saw these as humanly possible to divide or parse out. How can we know God without also choosing to be in relationship with his creation? But MacDonald actively encourages us to invite that participation. In his seminal essay on the imagination, he speaks of how we are to be trouvères, finders. To inquire into what God has made is the main function of the imagination, he says. To inquire into what God has made is the main function of the imagination. He says that it is in seeking the surprising things of God hidden in and throughout his creation that our imaginations, fulfilling their divine intent, will grow wise and rich, and thus we will have delightful new ideas and images and pictures and plays and songs and stories and scientific discoveries and revolutionary ideas to share with our fellow humans. MacDonald actually speaks of this as becoming playfellows with God in a game of joyful, of fruitful discovery. He writes, "But while the imagination of man has thus the divine function of putting thought into form, it has a duty altogether human, which is paramount to that function. The duty, namely, which springs from his immediate relation to the Father, that of following and finding out the divine imagination in whose image it was made. To do this, the man must watch its signs, its manifestations. He must contemplate what the Hebrew poets call the work of his hands." The imagination of man, MacDonald says, is made in the image of the imagination of God. Everything of man must have been of God first, and it will help much towards our understanding of the imagination and its functions in man if first we succeed in regarding aright the imagination of God, in which the imagination of man lives and moves and has its being. The best thing you can do for your fellow next to rousing his conscience is not to give him things to think about, but to wake things up that are within him, or say, to make him think things for himself. For some of you here, you reveal those things that you have found, those things that wake up others through song. For others of you, it is in the sharing of stories. For some, it is images on a canvas, or a festive feast made to be eaten. For some, it is drawing others into your excitement of the multivalency of language, or the ways in which Bart shows joy in a commentary on Romans, or the ways in which cleaning up an inner-city park incurs the return of butterflies, birds, and laughter. For some, it is showing the beauty of consecutive integers, the mycelium network. I'm pretty pumped about that one. Or photon rings, or pausing with a friend to breathe autumnal air, count the rings on an inching caterpillar, or invite them to a buck corral. Or returning to Narnia, or Middle-earth, or Earthsea, or Holst the Planets, or Ruskin's sketches, or Peterson's albums, or McLeish's lectures on why good science requires wise imaginations. MacDonald speaks in his collection of English devotional poetry of how he hopes to become the master of the hearing. This is what he hopes, to help his readers, his listeners, to better hear these poems he's placing before us in that book, poems that he believes will draw us deeper into the divine imagination, better enabling us to play together, lament together, joy together, live well together. And he hopes not only that we will listen to their antiphonal play with each other and with all the elements of God's creation, but that in doing so, we will raise our own voices in antiphonal response, swelling the song, finding new ways to follow the threading tunes, participating in the reweaving of this imaginative cosmos. No man could sing as he has sung, had others not sung before him. Deep answers unto deep, face to face, praise to praise. To the sound of the trumpet, the harp returns its own vibrating response. Alike, but oh how different. Time to sing.
Just before the ceremonial lowering of the microphone, I'd like to more properly introduce Wendy, my wife. We have been each other's constant companion in song since the early 70s when we both come from Northern Ontario, South Porcupine and Timmins. and South Porcupine. And she was she's an alumna of the first Ontario youth choirs in Ontario. So we've been singing together ever since. She will join you from her position in the front row, and I invite you to turn to Our God, He is a Castle Strong. George MacDonald's retranslation or translation of the more famous, perhaps, setting. For this one, I'll mostly play and invite you to sing.
Free.
Well, we're going to have just a brief conversation here, and then I'll invite you into the conversation. Let me ask you, Kirstin, how you got first drawn to MacDonald. Probably a while ago. I expect you read some MacDonald as a child, or had it read to you. But what was your first draw to MacDonald?
You're right. I had someone come along to me when I was about 6 years old and say, I know you like Narnia. And if you like Narnia, there's a story about some princesses and about a princess and some goblins I think you'll quite like. And she was right. And I don't think I was actually ever read MacDonald. I dove right into MacDonald myself at that time. And I can remember I must have been either 5 or 6 years old because of where I was at the time. And I remember the pastor in our church reading from Isaiah 6 in the year King Uzziah died. And he's reading about how there are the seraphim and how there are the coals, and Isaiah must do something even though he doesn't know what it is, and can he offer himself? And I thought, that's from the Princess and Curdie. And it was a few years before I realized it was actually the other way around. But that became a serendipitous, perhaps it was a bit of a foreboding. You know, there's no way I was going to get around falling into a life of literature and theology. But what MacDonald was doing for me there was helping me see, I was being pulled into the excitement of Scripture and understanding the truths of Scripture through his stories without even being aware of it. I already understood some of the key things in Isaiah. And also that moment for me, I look back many years later as a late teen, I had several friends say to me, how come it doesn't seem a big deal for you to say whatever God wants to do with your life, you're cool with? I had plenty of other struggles, don't get me wrong on that, but for some reason, that was never difficult for me to say, whatever you want to do, I'm okay with that. And I suddenly realized that I had learned that from that Isaiah scene in The Princess and Curdie, that I had gone through that struggle with Curdie and followed that struggle with him. And so that was one struggle that I didn't have to go through in life myself in the same way, because I'd already struggled through it with Curdie, which actually led to my work with Eugene Peterson on how we learn through story.
So you're really giving a good example here of how literature helps us to negotiate life. Mm-hmm. I mean, certainly for children, but also for adults. Mm-hmm. Would you say something about that?
No, it's okay. It is an example, and I think maybe what I springboard off of that, I think that's something that in the church we've really forgotten. We are supposed to be people. We are people of stories. The primary expression of who God is and how He loves us and how we are to live, is not an exegetical text. It's not a commentary. It is a story that we're supposed to live and imbibe and live through. And not only have we forgotten, we don't tell that story enough, but we don't tell all the stories around that story that help us understand that story better. And I think that extends out. When I was talking about how MacDonald and Scott wanted people to keep on remembering that it wasn't just the biblical story that we learn and engage through, but we engage the others who engage the biblical story in their stories. And we're supposed to be storytellers and story stewards. And it's only in telling our own stories, the stories, written stories, and our family stories, and the Bible stories, that we come to know who we are, and we understand that central story better for that. And I think we need to start remembering that we are people of story. That's how God chose to communicate the most important thing to us, and that's how we get to know each other and communicate with each other.
That's great, thank you. Andrew, when I called you up and asked you if you would lead us in some George MacDonald hymns, I don't know whether you knew any George MacDonald hymns, so I just took a chance. But I'd like to just ask you to comment briefly about your journey with MacDonald in preparing for this evening.
Sure. Well, when John asked me to lead the songs that we've sung so far, I started before connecting with Kirstin, I started digging through George MacDonald hymns and poems, and I found this poem that you're going to see in your books, which we're not going to sing. My child is lying on my knees, and it's in the last page. And okay, the last verse goes, "For all behind the starry sky, behind the world so broad, behind men's hearts and souls doth lie the infinite of God," which is a phrase that just hit me. The context of that phrase is that, as you can see in the opening line, his child, let's say the poet's child, is lying on his knees, and she is looking up to him. And I found it also striking that it's a she and not a boy child. And there's a real tenderness in, I found, his writings towards the female side of humanity. So the poem ends with, "Lo, Lord, I sit in thy wide space, my child upon my knee," which takes up the beginning. "She looketh up unto my face, and I look up to thee." And it's that mirroring of the divine and the human that really struck me. We're not going to take time to sing this one, but you might want to sing this on your own. I found the tune Macpherson's Farewell, a Scottish folk tune that just really conveys the tenderness of the lyric. So that's one of my discoveries, and I got one more, but I'll save it for the next time around.
Yeah, well, no, go ahead, tell us.
Go ahead, okay. If you'll turn one back, "Daylight Fades Away." There's a wonderful Genevan tune, Genevan 42, I think it's called. Daylight, da-da-dum-ba, dum-bum-bum-ba. We're going to sing this one in a bit. But I really loved, even though I don't know that it was ever sung as a hymn per se, it's a poem. And I must confess I took verses out and just chose 4. But it's in hymnals. This just in. But I just love the inner, like the kind of repeating chorus lines, as it were, in the hymn that add a cyclical quality to the linear quality of the hymn. It's just artistically and emotionally and theologically delightful. So we'll come to do that later on.
Yeah, you could say something about that.
Okay, we're fighting over who's going to speak here. John and I both had an opportunity a couple of weeks ago in Scotland to hear a wonderful presentation on MacDonald's translation of Luther's hymns. And it was presented by a woman, a scholar, who was startled one day when she was singing from her Lutheran hymn to see it translated by George MacDonald underneath, and she thought, surely not that George MacDonald, not the Princess and Curdy George MacDonald. Indeed it was. And MacDonald's translations of Luther hymns are not uncommon in Lutheran hymnals still today. The one we sang earlier, I'm sure most of you know as "Our Mighty Fortress is Our God." And it was interesting to hear her and to have read other scholars who talk about MacDonald's translations of Luther and how that hymn in particular is an example of how accurate MacDonald's translations were, and that MacDonald was much more accurate, and I'm just repeating what I've heard because I do not speak German, but much closer to Luther's sound, Luther's angularity, his earthiness to his language than the finer Victorian sensibilities of, I believe was it Catherine Winkworth's version? And MacDonald was actually friends with the Winkworth sisters. They were also mentored by George MacDonald, so they all knew each other. So these are people who knew each other who are translating the German together too.
Yeah. Okay, folks, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to say it's your turn. Does anybody have either a question or a comment? I'm happy to bring the mic to you, or you can stand up and speak up. Anybody want to raise a question, make a comment? Yes, go ahead, Peter.
So a quote like that, it's promoting imagination as something that's good in society. But how would MacDonald have approached the creative process himself? Is there any information about that? You know, there's lots of books on writing and creation that have come sort of from the influencers, but how did he approach
I think we get a hint of it when he tells us to go out and look at the work of his hands, of God's hands. He does, and when he talks about us, about how we are called to be trouvères, finders, that is how we create. And MacDonald actually parses this out. His essay on the imagination, I encourage you all, if you're interested in creativity, in artistry, in imagination, to read this seminal essay that shaped Chesterton and Lewis and Tolkien. All they wrote in the imagination really stems from this essay. It's called Imagination, Its Functions, and Its Culture. And you can find it on the internet easily. There's a shorter one called The Fantastic Imagination. It's also good. But the Imagination, Its Functions, and Culture is really a seminal essay. And in that, he talks about how actually calling us makers, as you would in the Greek, is actually not really that accurate because only God is a maker. And he would argue that even only God is the true pure creator, that actually we are finders, that we are to seek as we go out and pay closer attention to God's creation, closer attention to each other, closer attention to the words and the stories and the poems and the songs of others, that in doing so we will find new ways of seeing things, new understandings, and that is our imaginative acts of creation, if you will, is giving word or giving sight or sound, embodying what we discover in God's imagination. Does that, make some sense? Yeah.
Someone else. Question, comment? Go ahead. Joe.
Kirstin, for MacDonald, is imagination always good? I mean, I think that, like Mary in Magnificat says, he has scattered the crowd in the imagination of their heart.
Only in the King James Version.
Well, I know.
And that is really important. It's really interesting. Samuel Johnson's dictionary, when he puts that together, he uses that quotation as, in Samuel Johnson's dictionary, he has the definition of the word, and then he has a quotation from literature to explain what that word is. And that's the first major English language dictionary. And that is the quotation he uses to explain what imagination is, which has a massive impact on how, in the years following, people, particularly Christians, engage with the concept of imagination. MacDonald is very careful to parse out a wise imagination is the presence of a spirit of God. And he actually, in the essay on the imagination, he says, we could spend time talking about how bad story can shape us, how using your imagination wrongly can be dangerous. He does spend, and then he says, but we're not going to I don't want to spend too much time on the bad. I want to spend time dwelling on the good and how we grow in good ways. But he does take a really interesting look at Lady Macbeth and talks about how actually what she has is an absence of the imagination. That her husband, what saves him is the dagger he sees before him. The fact that he has a bit of imagination shows that he's not completely, there's still something good going on there, but she isn't even able to imagine. And I think probably when you read that, you can see that wrapped up with the concept of empathy, that she is lacking there. And lacking that imaginative empathy is why she is damned. So go explore that a little bit further. But I think he wants us, he spends more time looking at what is good and what we should draw towards rather than the opposite.
Yes, John, go ahead. Speak up.
It seems to be that much of contemporary theology, and if not most sermons, are focused on the pursuit or challenge to certainty. And I wonder if you could comment on the role of imagination and wonder in at least informing and maybe critiquing that aspect of current theology, or maybe you disagree with that.
You had a deep breath like you've got a deep idea. I'm sure he's got a deep idea. I think in some ways we're following the inheritance of Samuel Johnson's use of the imagination quotation there, and some of, perhaps unfairly, some of my colleagues have called the curse of the Enlightenment, but our need for certainty, and the reason why imagination is scary, the reason story is scary, the reason art is scary, the reason even music is scary is that we can't put tight boundaries, we can't curtail them. But the reality is we can't put tight boundaries around God. We can't put tight boundaries around honest exegesis of the text and reception of the text. We are people of a story. We are not people of a concordance. And that's how God has made us and who we're called to be. So I think if we're being true to our text, true to our God, then we have to figure out how to be comfortable with mystery and with not having sharp answers for everything.
And the image of the wind blows where it wills. We don't know where it comes from, and we don't know where it's going. So is everyone who is being born of the Spirit of God.
We're not in control.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that. Someone else? Yes, please. Can you stand up or speak up? Or
My main exposure to MacDonald's work was in his novel Mind's Mine, which is, of course,
That's amazing.
set in Scotland. So I was wondering if you could talk about maybe how the place that MacDonald grew up, like the actual land of Scotland, and also its stories and even Celtic spirituality, how that influenced him.
Can I write you a book? What's Mine's Mine? I encourage everyone to read it. It's one of the lesser-known novels. It was C.S. Lewis's favorite of MacDonald's realistic novels. And it is a novel that engages with historical social justice issues that afflicted MacDonald's own family. It's a story of people being cleared off the land, the Scots being cleared off the land by the wealthy English owners. MacDonald accurately predicts the extirpation, the eradication of certain species in that book. At the end of the story, the people are forced to leave, the clan is forced to leave to go to Canada with hopes that they might someday come back to their land. I think in that book, that book is actually based in some ways on MacDonald's own family, his own ancestors. So some of the things that happen in that story are stories from his own family. And it's a wonderful example of how he ties together families of his story with Isaiah, which holds the whole text together, with stories of Ossian, the Celtic, called the Celtic mythic poet, and as well as obviously Burns and Coleridge and Shakespeare. He weaves all those together, but this is tied into place. And I think one of the most important Scottishnesses of that text is people often talk about MacDonald as a writer fascinated with the German Romantics. And I think people have started to realize it's a bit bigger than that, and so people often say fascinated with the English and German Romantics, because Coleridge and Wordsworth are important too. But I think in focusing on that, people often forget that he's also a writer fascinated with Shakespeare. He's also a writer fascinated with Jacobean dramatists, with Plato, with Augustine, with, on and on and on. He's actually a writer who looks very closely at all of these. And one of his pushbacks against the Romantic movement happens very clearly in this text, which I think is so interesting. In the story, we have the romantic interests, two sisters, Christina and Mercy, who come up and meet the two young men from the clan and fall in love with them. But they are enamored with the romantic ideal. They talk about, they've heard about the Highland savage and the sublime mountains and the mysteries of all the tropes of romanticism are there. And they arrive in MacDonald's homeland. And so these are all things MacDonald himself is hearing in England all the time, right? This is the era in which tourism is happening for the first time and really burgeoning. And people want to go up and see the sublime mountains of Scotland and see the savage Highlanders. And for MacDonald, it's like these are the fields that my family plows. These are the hills I walk with my horse. Yes, they're beautiful, but they're real. They're tangible. There aren't Highland savages. These are my neighbors, my family, my friends. And he's bursting that romantic bubble into saying, no, these are real. This is a real place. These are real people. And you're missing something deeply beautiful and deeply good if you're just turning it into a painting or a picture and othering it, if you will, instead of I thouing it. And so he's calling people to see Scotland as a real place, to see Rob of the Angels, who is a man who has mental limitations. We don't know exactly what they are, but he is different. He communicates differently than the people in his community, and he is not this mystic on a page of Sir Walter Scott, but he's a real person who's part of the community, who the community loves and engages with, and he looks after the community in ways, and they look after him. And I think for me, this is one of the really exciting things in the book, that MacDonald is reminding us to, back again, to look at creation, look at nature, to know things, not to other them or see them as this romantic ideal.
And for him, the material world, the real world, as we would say, is a portal to the divine, or to the invisible world, or to... Yeah, a material portal, yeah. One last comment or question. Yes, go ahead, Colleen.
Thank you. I loved your talk. Very great. I noticed that MacDonald was not an advocate of penal substitution. I was wondering if you could talk about how his soteriological viewpoint not only impacted himself and his understanding of God, but also how it influenced those that he impacted.
Yeah, so that is huge, and I actually have on my computer a little paragraph that I've written specifically to address that question, because I'm not quick at thinking of these things, but I've thought out, which I would happily share with you and anyone else. And I'm sure Joe is grinning because we were talking around this topic just the other day. And I'm going to try to pull my brain together to answer this properly. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to do this justice because I'm a slow thinker, but I think MacDonald, start here. When MacDonald died, his obituaries talked about how, whilst the Scottish divines in the generation before him wrote a lot about God as loving Father, as opposed to the image of God as angry judge that had so prevailed, that it was actually MacDonald's stories that helped change the general public to accept this concept, or be more familiar with this concept, that God is loving Father. And not that God doesn't judge. MacDonald was very, very strong on that. His concept of obedience, C.S. Lewis talks about how that is one of MacDonald's most consistently strong themes, the need to be obedient. But that love prevails, and I think I'm gonna put the penal substitution answer slightly to the side, because I don't want to do that injustice. And as I said, I need to pull my thoughts together on that. But MacDonald he almost never says anything negative about anybody in all of his writing. He often talks about disagreeing, like he'll disagree with Herbert, his favorite poet, in places, but then he talks about how amazing a poet he is. And he disagrees with Dante here, and he says if, Dante, when he's talking about Dante, he says, really, Christians threw out the wrong between purgatory, hell, and heaven. They threw out the wrong one. The Protestants threw out the wrong one. And it's really important to MacDonald that he models agreeing and disagreeing with everybody. The one time he gets really angry and he can't seem to hold it in is with Jonathan Edwards. And this concept that we are sinners in the hands of an angry God, and worms, that makes him really angry. And I think he's seen people who are hurt by thinking of God that way, and it just makes him really angry, because first and foremost, we are loved children of God. And for him, that is so important. And so I think where I'm going to wrap that around to is the question I was perhaps more prepared for, that I hear the most often. And MacDonald scholars get so tired of this question because it's always the first one. MacDonald was a universalist, right? What does that mean? That dominates discussions on MacDonald, and it is far from the most important thing about MacDonald. But it's helpful maybe to understand his perception. MacDonald believes deeply in hell. He believes very deeply, and he writes about this in sermons. And I preface that all with MacDonald's not a theologian. He's not laying out dogma or doctrine. And I think we also, especially those of us who think theologically, we want to put him in that place. He's not systematic. He's an author and a literature teacher who also gives sermons. But I sort of lost my track of thought there a little bit, but MacDonald believes in hell, and he believes very strongly and repeats throughout his text that Christ is the way, the truth, and the life, and no man come to the Father but by me. No question for him on that. Where he gets uncomfortable for some people is that he believes that if someone does not come to understand the depth of God's love for them, that Christ is the way and the truth and life before they die, that there must be options afterwards. Because this is where he and Lewis differ a bit. Lewis sort of feels, as we see in The Great Divorce, Lewis is an annihilationist. So he believes that eventually if you cannot accept God's love, you'll just cease to exist. MacDonald cannot conceive that that a creature created by a God who is all love would not eventually succumb to that love. And so again, this isn't doctrine, this isn't dogma. He just cannot conceive of being able to resist that love forever, even if it takes the purgation of hell to help somebody get there. And maybe that sets in context a little bit your question about penal substitution too. But ask me further on that.
Well, on that heavy theological note, we'll conclude. Please thank my two guests, and then we're going to sing one more piece, and we'll be done.
We will sing. We sing.
Daylight,
Our evening is almost concluded, so I just want to thank you for coming. I want to just note two things that Imago is actively involved in. One of the things that Imago does is adopt projects. And those projects, if they come under the auspices of Imago, have the benefit of charitable status. And there's two events, one coming up fairly soon and one coming up a little later in January that I want to mention. One is with Mike Jansen, jazz pianist. Many of you will know of Mike. And many of you will know of the Toronto Mass Choir, which is a gospel choir under the direction of Karen Burke. The Mass Choir and Mike Jansen, they're teaming up for a Christmas concert at Kerner Hall. And that's happening on December 12th. I don't know if there's tickets still available, but I'm quite confident that it will sell out. The second thing I want to mention is that there's a project under Imago called the Trinity Bach Project. And their executive director happens to be here this evening, Chris Friesen. And you can get to talk with him after. Do you want to wave there, Chris? So that there's Chris. The Trinity Bach Project is a group that does, well, a lot of choral singing as well as instrumental works of Bach plus. And they're very high caliber performers. And they have a concert coming up January the 10th and 11th. And where is it going to be? Oh, it's at Little Trinity. Okay. Yeah, January 10th and 11th. And this one is going to be instrumental. They're doing a couple of Bach Brandenburg concertos and, I don't know, some other Baroque music. Yeah? Sorry, what? Oh, piano concerto. All right. So that's January 10th and 11th at Little Trinity Church. And you can look up Trinity Bach Project online. So with that, we conclude. Thank you once again to Kirstin and to... And thank you each and every one for coming. And as always at Imago events, we need a little bit of time at table. So there's some drinks back there and some sweets. And please take some time at table and get to talk to some people you haven't met yet. Thank you so much for coming and good night.